From Social Prosperity Partners, this is Community Catalysts. Welcome to Community Catalysts, the podcast that examines the qualities of community leadership and the many paths and forms it can take. I'm your host, Matt Lehrman. This September, ArtsJournal.com will mark its 25th year as the essential crossroads of arts and cultural journalism, connecting readers to a diverse array of stories from individual blogs and over 200 English-language newspapers, magazines, and publications worldwide. Our guest today is Douglas McLennan, the founder and editor of ArtsJournal. Doug is widely respected and deeply appreciated throughout the arts and cultural community as a thought leader. His particular focus on technology, arts, and journalism aims just beyond the horizon, which is an incredibly valuable talent for a community catalyst. Today, we're going to ask him to apply his insights not just to the realm of arts and culture, but to the overall responsibilities and challenges of local community leadership. Doug McLennan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
So, Doug, congratulations on 25 years of ArtsJournal. How are you going to celebrate?
Take a nap, maybe. I seriously wouldn't have had any idea when I came up with the idea for ArtsJournal 25 years ago that it would be anywhere 25 years. So I'm astonished.
Are you saying there's not going to be some museum exhibit, some symphony that's been commissioned, some musical theater review covering 25 years of arts journalism?
When we started the site, there was no content management system. So you had to code pages on the web from hand, which meant you had to learn code. And so there's no content management system. And over the years, we've been on 4 different platforms as the technology has gotten better and better. So last year, we actually got a little money together and put all of the stories, of which there's over 100,000 stories at this point, together in a database that can be searchable. So that's a sort of celebration.
That's great. So, Doug, take us back to 1999 when you founded ArtsJournal. The internet was young, and I had to go back and look this up. Google had been founded just a year earlier. Facebook wouldn't launch until 2004. Twitter in 2006. The iPhone wasn't even introduced until 2007. What was the original ArtsJournal mission, and how has that evolved over 25 years?
Well, I started out as a musician. I was a concert pianist. I went through Juilliard. I did all of that and went around the world playing concerts and whatever. And then ultimately got into journalism when I realized that that was a much better way of making money. And I became eventually the critic for the morning newspaper in Seattle, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which is sadly no longer with us. And at the time, websites were just a beginning thing. Newspapers barely had websites. And everybody knew that the digital transformation was going to be pretty profound, but nobody really understood how it was really going to upend a lot of institutions, basically, like newspapers. And I was browsing in the Barnes Collection website one day, actually at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I found a story about the Barnes Collection that they were having some more problems. It was a very significant story, but the story was about a month old. And it was not until a month later that I actually got to it because you just didn't have access to things in real time. And it occurred to me that there were probably stories in publications all over the world that were locked up, but now had been liberated by the internet. And if you could pull out the best of them, the most interesting ones of them, you could put them together in one place and essentially have the best arts page in the world. And so that's really how the site began.
You saw the opportunity to aggregate all of this information. 25 years on, is aggregation still what you think of as the driving mission for ArtsJournal?
I don't actually think of it as an aggregator anymore. I think of it as a curator. And we live in the age of curation. And, back then, the first iteration of the internet was really to connect people with all of the information in the world. We forget now that pre-internet, the world was a series of clubs, closed clubs, in which the valuable information that of a particular profession or interest group was locked behind sort of physical library, obviously, right? Then iteration of the second part of the web was we connected all the people together. And so that allowed us to talk to anyone in the world and be able to share anything, right? And so now we're starting into the third iteration of the world, where we're connecting all the things with all of the ideas and all of the people. And so you have this information explosion right now.
So today you are perched overlooking this confluence of technology and arts and journalism. And so I wonder if we could start by examining them separately. And could I ask you just to share very briefly what you see as some of the dominant forces shaping each of those fields today?
I would put them all under one rubric, actually. I think that in each of those cases, it's about audience. It's, can you get people to pay attention to whatever it is that is your definition of what's important or what's interesting? So technology companies don't really exist unless they scale to, a billion users or whatever that happens to be. The arts needs audience, and how do you get to the people that you want to reach? How do you create a community around them? And journalism is exactly the same way. We have created a system of journalism where the news that is important to people, the thing that they're willing to pay for or at least pay attention to, is also a battleground. And so each of those things is all about audience and how do you get to them.
Okay, but I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily, because within those, there are a number of things I've been thinking about. I mean, in journalism, you've got changed business models. You've got a lot of local institutions that no longer exist. You've got ownership by corporate conglomerates, and as a result, changes of editorial focus of what's going on. And in some cases, the whole idea of a newspaper of record has just gone away completely, favoring instead pay per click and whatever is popular, right? Is there anything else in the journalism realm that you think of, and specifically you just go, but we need to recognize these are the realities going on there?
It's interesting. People talk about a golden age of journalism. And if you ask them what was the golden age of journalism, they say the 50s, 60s, 70s, Edward Murrow and Walter Cronkite and
Woodward and Bernstein.
Exactly. And people look back at that era and they go, that's when the news was really the news. There was authority, right? Well, the golden age of journalism, actually, you could say, was maybe the 1850s, 1860s. New York had 57 newspapers that you could choose from. There were a billion copies of newspapers, for lack of a better word, at the time, because a lot of them were pamphlets or one-page things. But a billion copies sold in a country whose population was about 25 million. So there was diversity of voice then. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was a whole lot of consolidation. You had 3 television networks. You had a paper or 2 in each city, but you weren't getting a whole range of opinion, right? Like, one might say that a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff that has happened in the last few years has happened because we now have access to so many other voices with authority, right? So this is a long way of sort of answering your question, but I think that the problem here is not that journalism is broken in any kind of way. journalism. In fact, I look at 25 years ago when we were collecting stories, and the stories today, frankly, are much better. There's much more diversity. There's much more in depth. There's much more authority. What's broken is the business model. The business model that worked for a couple of hundred years was news is something that people really want. And they're willing to pay a little bit, but they're not willing to pay enough to actually pay for the cost of producing it and getting it to you. And so what did we do? We advertise. We sell our community. We sell the attention of the people who want to get the news to advertisers, people who want to get their message out to people. What has happened in the internet era is suddenly you can put an ad on every web page out there, and there's so much ad stock available that the monopolies that news organizations used to have doesn't exist anymore. And so that's been the collapse. It's the collapse of the business model.
So let's talk then about what's going on in the realm of arts and culture, because the similar kind of challenge, you anchored this in about audience. Well, today's arts and cultural sector is recovering from COVID. It is now, as it has long been, suffering a demographic challenge with older audiences not necessarily being replaced by younger audiences. There is a financial frailty built into it. And in the journalism side, if people aren't willing in their subscriptions to pay enough, then the newspapers had to go and advertise. In the arts, if people aren't willing to pay enough for museum admissions or for tickets, then the nonprofit model means they were going after contributions.
And the nonprofit model, we got to remember, is only about 60 years old. So previous to that, it was all ticket revenue or patronage, right? Mozart had a patron, but it is actually the same issue in a way. It's a different facet. I mean, to say that audiences for the arts are declining, I think completely misses the idea. There is more creativity, more ability to produce creative things. There are, arts education right now is flourishing in a way it never has before. One can arguably say when it was in schools, it was a pretty imperfect way an ineffective way of being able to expose people to the arts. Now you have people all over the world looking at YouTube's learning how to strum a guitar or figure out a lick. The technical ability of your average musician today is so much higher than it ever has been in history because of the way that you have access to it. Our exposure to the vast sort of history and library of all recorded content, you can go and see Horowitz playing at Carnegie Hall. 30 years ago, you couldn't see that unless you actually happened to get it on television, right? So there's an explosion in the amount of creativity and arts that people are exposed to and are using right now. What has happened again, is a failure of the business model. I can tie these two things together because in the case of newspapers, they knew that the digital world was going to change things, but they didn't think about it strategically, right? And in the absence of being able to look ahead and say, these are the things that matter most to us as a newspaper business and how we could do this better, there was a vacuum. And so what happened? The big tech companies came in, wrote their own rules, and now we all live by the tech rules, right? What that means is that Apple is able to charge a 30% tax on any creativity that goes through its app platform or subscription platform or anything. We have these middlemen now in the nature of the big tech companies, which you can't operate today without going through them. But they take an enormous tax, and that's billions and billions and billions of dollars that come out of it. In the case of the arts, we also weren't around as this stuff was being decided, right? I think about, for instance, when music became digital and moved online. It was file sharing initially. And so they wrote the schemas to figure out how you were going to tag music. Well, okay, so what they did was pop music's really important, and so we'll tag everything and create a schema that describes music in a pop music world.
Right, and let me just make sure. When you say we're going to tag everything, you mean someone is going to go in and write words to attach to songs to say, this is mellow, this is jazzy, this is instrumental, or something like that.
Exactly. We assign it into categories, right? And that works fine for pop music because that's what it was designed for. But symphony orchestras or classical music never was part of that conversation. And it turns out that the tagging system, the categorization system, is horrible for classical music. If you have a 4-movement symphony and Tchaikovsky is the composer, but you're really interested in who the conductor is and what the orchestra is, because that's more important, because that's going to be a thing. Pop music doesn't anticipate in that. So that means we've now had 20 years. It wasn't until about 4 years ago that a new schema system came up that described classical music. So you could actually find things in the way that you want. And so what you end up with, we've lost an entire generation of people who, if there wasn't as much friction to be able to get access to what it was that you wanted or be able to stumble across it, we're not going to recover that back.
Doug, what strikes me about what you've just said is that you said journalism is actually strong and arts and culture is strong. What's changed is the locale of where it's happening. And the conventional institutions that were doing this don't have a lock on the business model anymore, but individuals, people, groups are reorganizing and finding other ways to communicate all of that content, all of that information. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, that's the one half of it. Matt, you've been around the arts long enough that you know that we all kind of fetishize this idea of the live experience, the being there in the group of people, in the whatever. Somewhere along the way, we kind of lost what that actually means. That we sort of take it for granted. And we also sort of leaned on it as like, oh, yeah, no, recording, you can sort of get that, but to really appreciate, you have to have the live performance. Well, actually, the live performance, we were really lazy, right? It's like, who wants to go fight traffic, get into a hall, sit in an uncomfortable seat? The guy next to me is itching, and the guy 2 rows down is coughing, and I'm afraid I'm going to get, there are all sorts of things that are unpleasant about the live experience, right?
And all sorts of hyperbole about arts marketing that promises a transformative experience, a magnificent thing. But on that night, it might not have been.
Yeah, and so people go, they maybe they buy the hype, right? And they go, God, that was a pain in the ass. And hey, guess what? They played 180 concerts this year, and that felt like 181. So it kind of lost that specialness. But I sort of liken it to the slow food movement, right? So when fast food came in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it kind of took off everywhere, right? It was appealing because it was the same wherever you went. People like familiarity. You could predict what it was going to be like. It had all sorts of fat and kind of good tasting stuff that worked on your brain. And so fast food was sort of like, wow, people wanted fast food. But it started to occur to people after a while that, wait, this isn't very nutritious. It isn't really good for us. And actually, it doesn't really taste that good. And so was born this slow food idea where the provenance of something is important, where the ingredients is important, where how you consume it, what the experience is, the community of it, the whole culture. You build a culture around it. And it became this huge thing. And for anybody who cares about food, it becomes a way that you experience something that, let's face it, is just a kind of thing that we all have to do, right? It becomes an art. And that's sort of my thought about what the art experience is that you can consume vast quantities of culture on your phone or on your computer, and it just scrolls by. It, after a while, feels not terribly nutritious. And one of the reasons that big festivals have become so popular in the last 10 years is that people actually crave those unique experiences that give you something that just isn't reproducible online. And where we have to go is to figure out what is that essential quality about being in a crowd with other people, having an experience that you can't have on your screen. I think that there's a craving for that, and there will be.
I could not agree with you more. And I should have pointed out earlier, you and I have known each other, 15 or 16 years now, back from when I worked in nonprofit arts and cultural administration. And what I thought was really interesting about what you just said was you were talking about kind of the intersection of journalism and the arts. But for the listeners of this podcast who are community leaders in cities and towns, and whether they're elected or appointed or staff or civic leaders in some other way or nonprofit leaders, it's not just journalism and the arts we're talking about. We're talking about fundamentals of where and how people gather for shared experiences and shared understanding. And I just want to make sure, am I hearing you right? We don't have to be just talking about concerts and exhibits. We're talking about how we actually coexist physically as a society.
And how we experience the surroundings that we're in. I'm shocked. There was a tunnel that opened in Seattle. They replaced a big old ugly viaduct on the waterfront. And so they built this tunnel, right? And everybody was excited about the tunnel. Well, the first time I went into the tunnel, I was thinking, wow, this is about as ugly and generic and, it gets you functionally from place A to place B. But how could you have made this experience of driving through this tunnel something that told you were in Seattle on the waterfront in some way that was more interesting? And I wrote a piece about that. And all these people wrote in to go, what are you talking about? Design is just an extra thing. It doesn't, we want to get from point A to point B. And I think that there are a lot of people who don't really understand that the design, the purposeful thinking about the place that you're in, the experience you want to have people the experience you want people to have, and how you guide people to interact with one another is a really crucial thing. It's something that technology thinks about all the time. There's UX designers in every tech company. That's a big thing. It happens in the arts, although, as I just said, not enough in terms of thinking about that full experience. And it also happens in journalism, right? It's like, I don't want to go to a web page and then a pop-up comes on, or, I have to, there are all sorts of ways that there's friction there that make it an unpleasant experience. So we are now at the sort of technological point of sophistication that we can design experiences for people in whatever medium, in whatever technology, in whatever physical space, in ways that we've never been able to do before. And I think that being intentional about that stuff becomes more and more important.
Hi, this is Matt. I trust you're enjoying this conversation as much as I am. Doug McLennan has much more to share, so we will continue our interview next week and shift our focus from journalism and the arts to technology and the rise of artificial intelligence. Doug has some thought-provoking ideas on its implications for local governance. You'll find a link to ArtsJournal and to Doug's blog, Diacritical, in this episode's program notes. This episode was produced by Kerry Lengel and edited by Nick Living the Dream Tantillo. Jenna Maisel is our production assistant. Our executive producer is John Little. I'm Matt Lehrman of Social Prosperity Partners. If you have a question, comment, or story to share, reach me at 602-688-2724 or podcast at socialprosperity.us. I'd love to hear from you. We'll be back next week with part 2 of our Community Catalyst conversation with Doug McLennan.